opportunity. Okay, so I am very happy to introduce Dr. Rhyne. She has been seeing birds and other exotic animals in the Asheville, North Carolina area since 2004. We are grateful to have her in this area. She sees many Phoenix Landing birds, both here at the adoption center and if they've been adopted locally. So in practice, she also serves as the veterinarian for the AZA accredited Western North Carolina Nature Center. So she gets to work with all kinds of cool animals too there. She's also a member of the Association of Avian Veterinarians and is passionate about her work with birds. So welcome, Dr. Rhyne. We're very happy to have you here and look forward to learning more from you.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate it. It's great to be here. I'm really happy to be able to do this talk for you guys. And I hope that everyone learns a little something. And let's see here. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Let's see here. Oh, okay. Hang on just a second. There we go. Okay, so I am going to talk to you guys today about bird poop, something that everyone who has a bird is going to be intimately familiar with. You can't really get away from it. So I thought it would be a nice topic to kind of review what all we should know as owners of birds about their poop, and kind of give you a little bit of information on what veterinarians are learning through your bird's poop. So there's more to it than what you might think. Let's see, we'll go ahead and get started. So first, I always like to review, especially for those who may not have birds yet, why do we really need to do physical exams? Why do we need to do tests on birds' poop? And it just like, you know, with us and with any other animal we might have, we want to do exams on them when they are considered healthy. So we want to do an annual wellness visit. Many people just don't think about doing that for birds, especially if they're new bird owners, but it's really critical. You want to do a healthy bird visit once a year at least, so that you can have the veterinarian talk to you a little bit about what's the latest husbandry recommendations. You know, what do you need to know to help prevent behavior problems, or if there's behavior issues starting, you know, that's a good time to discuss that. Was there new information about diet? So all of these things are perfect at discussing during an annual wellness visit. And of course, these are things that are going to help us in hopefully preventing disease in birds. That's always our goal, is that we can prevent a problem, because we all know how difficult it can be to treat problems once they've started. A wellness visit allows us to also kind of keep track of that bird's weight. It can be very easy to miss changes, either weight gain or weight losses, when you're seeing the bird day to day. So it allows the vet to assess that, and of course do a physical exam, do some baseline blood work, and a fecal gram stain is often included with that annual wellness visit. In addition to that, it's always important to have an exam on a bird that is showing signs of being fluffed, which, if you're not familiar what that is, we'll go through that in a minute. But if that bird is acting unusual or fluffed at odd times, so when there's usually a lot of activity going on around them, they're not going to appear fluffed usually. Or if that behavior is lasting for longer than you would expect. So usually that's going to be for longer than a day. Birds do go through kind of normal sleepy periods, but once you are familiar with their habits, you'll know when that is expected and when it's not. And of course, if you are noticing problems such as digestive issues, breathing difficulty, any bleeding, all those kind of things would be reasons to get an exam done as soon as possible. So what are we doing when we do a physical exam? The physical exam in birds is very comprehensive. We're looking at a lot of different systems by doing a physical exam, where we can see and touch listen to their heart, listen to their lungs and air sacs. And so you just like a physical exam on a dog or a cat, this is extremely important in picking up on subtle changes that might indicate an illness. With a bird, maybe a little bit unlike a mammal, we often are going to try to do this physical exam in a fairly quick fashion to minimize the amount of stress, because of course they are going to need to be restrained, and most birds are not used to that, so it can be stressful. So most avian vets will do a comprehensive exam in a relatively short period of time. They may not necessarily tell you everything that they're looking at while they're doing it. But this list gives you a somewhat comprehensive list as far as the different kinds of things that they are looking at, and there's a lot of changes that can be determined and picked up on by doing that physical exam. So more specifically, when we're talking about a sick bird, there are things as bird owners that you will want to be aware of and looking out for. So things that would help you to know, oh, my bird might actually need to have that exam unexpectedly. Signs would include having a decreased thirst or appetite, or it can even be that the thirst and appetite has really picked up. It's very increased. Those can be very abnormal things in birds, as well as vomiting, or if your bird is regurgitating very, very frequently. So vomiting is always considered abnormal, and it's important to know what the difference of those two things is, so you can describe that to your veterinarian. Vomiting will often be something that happens pretty suddenly, and most birds, when they vomit, will sling their head very quickly, usually side to side, and they'll expel food out when they do that. So sometimes this happens so quickly, it may land on the side of the cage or on a toy in the cage. A lot of times it will land on the feathers of the bird's head. So if you're noticing dried food on the top of your bird's head, that could be a sign that he has been or she's been vomiting. Regurgitation is a lot more passive. So a lot of times regurgitation is going to be something that can be hormonal or behavioral in its origin. Usually birds will either tap their beak really repeatedly on something right before they regurgitate, or they may bob their head up and down before they regurgitate in order to try to get the contents of the crop up out of the crop and into their mouth. And then often it'll also go onto an object or onto a person. So regurgitation can be normal, can be a normal behavioral thing, but it can also happen with certain kinds of illnesses, heavy metal toxins and things like that, infections in the crop. So if it's happening at an increased frequency, that's definitely something to note and have an exam done. Of course, diarrhea and other dropping changes, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. And in order to know if your bird's having diarrhea, you do have to know what the components of a dropping would be. So there are three components, and we will go into detail in just a few minutes, but the three components are urine, urates, and the feces. And the diagram just to the right has a nice normal picture of what a healthy dropping would look like. Of course, like I said earlier, a sign of a sick and painful bird would be one that is fluffed when they're at rest. So their eyes are going to be closed often. Their feathers will often be sort of poofed out from their body instead of slick against their body. They may sit with a sort of hunched posture where they're not kind of upright. They're just sort of sitting down on the breast muscle or on their belly without really using a lot of strength. And sometimes they'll actually go down to the bottom of the cage if they feel really weak. So these are all signs that you may have a sick bird on your hand, and definitely would be reasons to be seen as soon as possible by an experienced avian vet. So going a little bit more in detail with the dropping components, The urine is the first one we're going to talk about, and normal urine is going to be sort of um, I would say a kind of clear, cloudy, possibly mucousy fluid that is going to get absorbed into your cage paper pretty quickly. You may see a little outline outside of the feces where that moisture has absorbed. The um, the urine is made in the kidneys, of course, and then it empties down into the uridium of the cloaca before it is eliminated with the dropping. When we have abnormal urine, there can be a number of things that you'll notice. A greenish color of urine would indicate possibly liver disease or some kind of toxicity, or it can indicate hemolysis, which would be bleeding somewhere or some rupture of some blood cells within the body, and the body's trying to recirculate those components of the blood cells. So greenish urine definitely can be abnormal. If you're noticing red streaks or red color in the area that the urine should be, then that could indicate that we have some bleeding either in the reproductive tract or in the urinary tract. There could be a tumor present, a foreign body, which would be an object that was swallowed that should not be present in the cloaca area. There could be infection. There could be some kind of clotting problem in that bird that's allowing it to bleed abnormally. Or there could be heavy metal toxins inside of the bird that's affecting its ability to clot. So anything that could really increase bleeding could cause that red color. Another thing that can be abnormal in urine would be an increased volume. That's called polyuria. An increased volume would be the picture there to the left on that paper towel. Increased amount of urine has many potential causes. Birds can get diabetes, so that can, just like with other animals, cause there to be increased amounts of urine. Infections, either in the kidneys or sometimes in the GI tract, will cause increased amounts of urine, usually because they're trying to drink more water to help with flushing out that infection. Liver disease can lead to increased amounts of urine. Stress, what they call stress droppings, often will produce droppings that have increased urine, and anything that could cause increased thirst, even if it was, say, a abnormally hot day and the bird was drinking more water than normal, then they're going to have a couple of droppings that may have more urine than normal. When there's increased volume of urine in the feces, often the actual feces will look more worm-like. So when the dropping comes out of the bird, generally it's a relatively passive procedure. So normally it just drops down, by gravity to the paper, and all those components come with it. But if there's a lot of urine that has been produced, then that dropping may be produced a lot more forcefully. So it may come out with a lot more force behind it because of all of that urine. And that just causes that feces, which is formed in the intestines, to not just passively spiral and land, in a nice little curl like that top picture has, but it will come out in a little bit more forceful pattern and look a little bit more like a worm. So that's important to kind of notice with your feces or with the droppings. And of course, there can be decreased volume of the urine. So if the bird is dehydrated, not taking enough water in, or wasn't given enough water, then those droppings can be very sticky. There may not be much urine present, and they may actually even stick around the feathers near the vent. So that can be something that I'll notice on an exam, is if there is evidence that the droppings haven't been falling like they should, and they've been actually collecting in the feathers around the vent. So that is one component of the dropping, our urine. Our second component of the dropping is called the urates. And this is the white chalky part of the dropping. It's usually kind of white, but maybe a little bit cream colored. And it's going to be on the outside of that feces. Um, Urates are a type of uric acid crystal, and it is also made in the kidneys and empties into the uridium of the cloaca. You can have abnormal urates, and some examples of what would be abnormal would be a change in the color. So either greenish or a yellow color could indicate things like liver disease or some kind of toxicity, or again, hemolysis. So these things could lead to bilirubinuria, which is basically an increase of a product that would normally be eliminated through a normally functioning liver. So greenish or yellowish color can be abnormal. An increased amount of urates. So you get a sense when you have a bird of what's normal for these different components. And if you're seeing a large amount that would normally not be there, that could indicate either that you're feeding a diet too high in protein, or more often than that is that the birds stopped eating their normal diet. So they're having a low appetite, and because birds have such high metabolism, they will start to break down their own muscle for energy pretty quickly. So they'll lose weight very quickly. And because they're breaking down that muscle, you may still see droppings, but they may have a really large amount of urates present due to that muscle breakdown. And much like the urine, you can also have red streaks or color present in the urates. And again, this is going to be potentially due to bleeding in the urinary or reproductive tract, a tumor, a foreign body that should not have been there and been ingested, an infection of some kind, a clotting problem that's allowing for bleeding that shouldn't normally happen, or heavy metal toxicosis, which again would lead to bleeding that should not be happening. So that's your urates. And finally, the third component is the feces. Normal feces in birds is going to be kind of a brown to green color. Usually birds that eat mostly pellets will have brownish looking feces, and birds that eat mostly seed will have more greenish looking feces. But when it comes out of the body in that dropping, it should more or less curl in on itself into a little spiral. Of course, the feces themselves are made in the intestines, and they should somewhat have the shape of that intestinal tract. So they should be tubular, and then they will empty into the proctodeum of the cloaca. There are a lot of abnormalities that can happen with feces, and one of the very common ones would be if you have a bird that normally has brown colored feces that suddenly turns green. This can be a sign that, again, we have some liver disease, or we may have toxicosis, some kind of toxin, or there may be hemolysis present. If there seems to be no kind of pigment, or it's kind of a chalky color, it's just a different color than normal, normally if it's brown and all of a sudden it loses that color, then that can be an indicator of liver disease. And one thing that's important to know, I think a lot of people do assume if their bird is passing something out of their vent or cloaca, that they must be eating something. And unfortunately, a bird that is not eating can still pass some droppings. They'll often be very soft and green and quite mucousy, and only maybe a little bit of form to them. This is due to, again, the bird breaking down muscle for energy, and the intestines will often still secrete some mucus. So you may have urine, and you may have urates, and you may have some mucus from the intestines, but there's no digested food. And so you can have a dropping that is passed on a bird that is not eating, or not eating very much, but the consistency of that feces is very different. So it's important to be able to recognize that. A dropping that has feces that has no form or shape to it, so there's not a tubular shape, would be considered diarrhea. So there are a lot of options as far as how abnormal feces can look. Diarrhea is very specific. So that is a dropping where the feces is going to just splat onto the paper. And when you look at it, there's no form, there's no little tubular pieces to that feces. It's just one big splat. This can happen due to infection, toxicities, any kind of organ dysfunction. So kidneys that aren't working properly, electrolytes that aren't working properly, a lot of potential reasons why this can happen. Again, decreased volume, just like with the decreased urine, that could be a bird that's not drinking enough. Decreased volume could, of course, be a bird that's not eating enough. So you normally have a macaw that has nice big droppings, and all of a sudden they're very, very tiny. That can be a very big sign and a quick sign to know that your bird's not eating properly. If there are streaks of blood, red color or black color, again, this can indicate that there's bleeding in the GI tract. So we might have a tumor present. There could be a foreign body present. There could be infection, clotting problem, heavy metal, or a reproductive problem. So very similar to the other components. If there is undigested food, or if there's a very unusual texture to the droppings, so that can indicate that there's some kind of maldigestive problem. So there could be an issue going on with the pancreas. There could be a disease like PDD. There could be infection. There could be cancer. So that's important to notice if there is undigested food. And then a lot of times if you have a bird that's on a pellet diet, you may not notice this because their food is usually fairly processed and ground down into that pellet. So there's not going to be chunks of pellet present. But if you have a bird that's eating seeds, or sometimes some fresh foods will do the same thing, they may pass through undigested and come out relatively whole. And then finally, if your bird has droppings that are very odoriferous, that can be very abnormal. So most people assume that feces is supposed to have a strong, bad odor, and it's not going to be necessarily a pleasant odor or perfumey odor, but you should not be able to smell your bird's feces from across the room. If they are having a bowel movement and you can tell right away, or as soon as you walk into the room, you can smell, there's a good chance that bird has an infection of some kind. And it may be a secondary infection and there's something else going on, but that's a strong indicator that something is not quite normal.
Okay. While we're on this slide, someone had a question about the middle picture, if that is diarrhea.
Yes, that middle picture is an example of diarrhea. You can see there's really not much shape to that feces that's in the middle. It's kind of mucusy looking. It's also very green, which is probably another abnormality for that bird. But yes, that's a good example of diarrhea. And then the one at the bottom is a good example of the undigested seed that's passing through. You can see some little pieces of millet in those droppings.
Great, thank you.
And those urates are also quite yellow. Okay, good question. Okay, so let's see here. So to highlight just a couple things that can be mostly normal, but some people do initially worry that they could be abnormal. Stress samples are fairly common. If you have a bird that's had a stressful event, maybe a dog barking in its face, or it got a nail trim, or it had to go on a car ride, you may notice they pass a dropping or two that's got a lot of urine in that. So that can be very normal, and it's just a matter of those intestines and everything moving fairly quickly, quicker than it normally would. And generally that causes there to be a dropping that has lots of urine and maybe not very much feces present, that's normal. It should pretty much go back to normal as soon as the bird calms back down. So that's not anything to be too worried about. Food dye and colorings or brightly colored fruit can definitely change the color of the feces, and because the feces is colored and changed, it can look like also the urine and the urates is a different color. Some pellets will do this. So especially if your bird tends to pick out certain color pellets, maybe one day picks out blue and the next day picks out red, you may notice that there's a change in those droppings that correlates very closely. It should definitely not be an ongoing thing. So you'll have one or two abnormal droppings and then that food has passed through them and then it should go back to normal. So that should be a very temporary thing. Same thing with certain types of fruit. So some birds, if they eat blueberries or blackberries or something like that, they may have some droppings that have a really dark, almost purpley color to them. And that might last for a couple of droppings and then they should go back to normal fairly quickly. And of course, if there's anything that your bird has eaten that's got a lot of water in it, a lot of melons, maybe like this, or watermelon, or if there's something that he's eaten that's got a lot of sugar, then that can cause a lot of urine to form, and you might see a dropping that's got a lot of volume to it, especially the urine. Those again can be normal. You just have to keep in mind, what has my bird been eating, in the past few hours that may have led to this, and also does it clear up pretty much right away. So if there's one or two of these droppings, then if they continue throughout the day, through the next day, then that's something to have checked out, especially if their food is back to normal. But if it's a one or two isolated dropping, then that can be something totally normal. Okay, so let's see here. As far as monitoring your droppings, now that we know what is normal for a bird's dropping and what is abnormal, it's really important to put into action monitoring these droppings on a very regular basis. Most of us are aware that birds love to hide signs of illness. So they're prey animals in the wild, and so they really are experts at being able to hide that they are ill, or they're fighting off something, or they're not quite feeling good, and they're not going to, even though they're really close to you, they're not going to necessarily want to show you that they're ill until they really are feeling bad. So part of your job and responsibility as a bird owner is to try to monitor as much as you can. And one of the easiest things you can do is to monitor their droppings every day. You can do this quite easily by when you change your bird's cage paper. You can do this daily, you should do it daily. And when you do, you can take a visual assessment of, what am I seeing? Is the number, location, and consistency of these droppings typical for my bird? You get a sense very quickly with how much birds poop, what's normal and what's not normal for your bird. And if you are used to seeing a certain amount in a day, and all of a sudden it looks like there's maybe half as much as normal, or the consistency of those droppings is very different, that may be your first sign that your bird is not doing well and you want to start to try to get a visit to a vet. So take note of the number that your bird's having. Little birds are going to have quite a few droppings in a day. A budgie may have somewhere around 40 or so droppings in a day, and larger birds tend to have less, but you'll also be able to take note of what's happening with those different components. I like using a flat substrate on the bottom of the cage, just so that you can easily change it. You can easily visualize the droppings, first of all. Any kind of bedding that's like a shaving or some kind of particulate bedding, it tends to hide those droppings. You only see maybe bits and pieces of the dropping when they have them. So it's really hard to monitor your bird's droppings with something like a particulate bedding. The other thing that I'm not a big fan of particulate bedding for is that those beddings are really good at harboring molds and mildews, bacterias, and of course they also create dust. And birds are so sensitive with their respiratory tract. The way that their respiratory tract works, they really can be much more sensitive to poor air quality than we are. And they're living in a very, even though they may be out of their cage quite a bit, they're still living in a relatively small environment that's closed in and very close to their droppings. So you want to make that environment as clean as possible. The best way to do that is to have something like a newspaper or paper towel, or some people like puppy pads, but something at the bottom that's nice and flat that you are going to be motivated to change every day. I also like to recommend to use a mister bottle when you're going to change the paper. Mist the bottom of that cage paper to kind of minimize the aerosolized dander and bacteria, anything else that might start to come up whenever you start to change the paper. So mist it and then fold in the sides of the paper gently, so that you're minimizing how much goes up into the air. And in addition to that, wear a mask. I mean, we're all used to masks now, and hopefully we're going to have them around for a while. And masks are great to use when you're changing your bird's droppings. There are some diseases that you don't want to contract, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But this is a good reason to wear a mask, is when you're changing your bird's cage paper. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the fecal gram stain. So a fecal gram stain is a very non-invasive screening test. So it's a test that as veterinarians we like to do for birds, because we can get a lot of information from it, and it doesn't hurt the bird at all. We just collect the sample that they've already provided for us, but it's a very good non-invasive test. So the reason why it's so helpful, birds have a relatively short GI tract, so a relatively short intestinal tract compared to a lot of mammals. And because of that, they're very reliant on a specific population of what we call good bacteria. So those good bacteria are mostly gram-positive organisms, and usually they're gram-positive rods. So when we do a gram stain, just to kind of technically let you know if you're not aware, we'll take a section or a piece of feces. So we don't need the urine, we don't need the white chalky urates, but we'll take the feces part of it, and we'll take just the tiniest little smear and smear that onto a microscope slide. So just a tiniest little layer that almost looks like a little film onto the slide, and then that slide gets stained. It goes through a series of stains where we're trying to stain the certain categories of bacteria. And when we get the different categories of bacteria stained, then we can do a count. It's basically like a percentage count of those different types of bacteria. So we're looking at gram-positive rods, gram-positive cocci, gram-negative rods, and we'll also look for things like yeast. Gram negatives usually are the pink color, gram positives are usually the purple color. And that's just sort of for you guys that might be interested in that. So when we are doing the gram stain, we are getting a count or a percentage of, it's sort of a general representation of what's happening in that gut flora. If we find that our count is mostly gram-positive rods, then we're very happy, because that's normal. That's what we want to see with most of our parrots. not so much for chickens and raptors. That's a whole different ball game. But for parrots, that's what we want to see. If we see that our gram-negative population is starting to climb and we have a higher percentage than what we're wanting to see, then that can indicate a couple of things. It can indicate a primary infection or maybe even a toxin that that bird's been exposed to. It can directly affect the gut flora. But a lot of times we are dealing with a secondary problem. Something else in the bird's body is affecting the immune system or affecting the motility of the GI tract. And it can be an indicator that we need to keep digging further. We need to do some more blood work, or we need to do some radiographs or some other tests, depending on what the blood work shows us. So it's a great test to use. It is important that we run this test on what we call, a normal sample, so not a stress sample like we talked about a minute ago. The stress sample happens when the intestines and the GI tract is moving very quickly, so that whatever feces comes out with a stress sample usually hasn't had time to absorb the proper amounts of bacteria, and so if we were to run a gram stain on a stress sample, there would be very few bacteria present, so what we consider scant, and it just doesn't give us a realistic representation. So we want a sample that they've done before they got into the car, before they're in the clinic, ideally one that was at home under a normal, situation or circumstance. And of course, it needs to still be moist. It can't be dried out. So put the sample into a baggie or a plastic container without a paper towel or without paper, so there's not an opportunity for it to dry out before you get to the clinic. And then I've listed here a few, and there are tons of diseases that we are able to run, or a few diseases that we're able to detect by testing feces. So of course, there are fecal cultures that can be done. That is a more specific identification of different bacterial infections that you can do, or you can do fungal cultures as well on the feces. So your gram stain doesn't tell you exactly what kind of bacteria you have. You just have the categories of bacteria. A culture would be a lot more specific as far as identifying particular bacteria that could be pathogenic. So that's one difference there that I wanted to highlight. But this slide is relating to different kinds of PCR tests. PCR tests are usually checking for DNA components of different organisms, sometimes bacteria, sometimes viruses. And these PCR tests can sometimes be done on blood or swabs of the respiratory tract. But a lot of these organisms can also be shed in the feces. And so we can do swabs of the cloaca or sometimes just swabs of the feces. And if we're looking for a particular organism, we might be able to pick up on psittacosis, which is the top one that I mentioned. Psittacosis is the disease that all bird owners should be aware of because it is zoonotic, meaning that if your bird has it, you have the potential of contracting it. It is treatable, so it is something that I do recommend for new bird owners to at least do a screening test for. And this is also the reason why it's a good idea to put a mask on whenever you're changing your bird's cage paper. The psittacosis organism can be shed in respiratory secretions, but it can also be shed in the feces. So people are vulnerable to inhaling that when they're changing the cage paper. So that is one thing I would definitely recommend. And then these two other diseases I just mentioned, psittacine beak and feather disease is a viral disease. Many different ways of confirming this virus, but one of them would be swabbing the cloaca, where they can pick up on viral particles. And then various herpes viruses can also be identified by swabbing the cloaca with a PCR test. And there's a slew of others, but I just wanted to name and show you that, you know, we can get a lot from the feces and from the cloaca. So now let's move on a little bit. Now that we know a lot about poop, how do we want to get rid of it? Because of course, no one wants to live with a lot of poop in their house, and the birds don't want to have a lot of poop in their cage. So there's a kind of a good way to go about the process. And the first step is that you need to be able to clean the visible poop. So basically, when you can remove the big parts of the feces, you're going to be removing 90% of the organisms, of the microbes. I would recommend to do spritz whatever you're cleaning with a little bit of water, so that you can, especially if you have a lot of dried on debris, it really can help you loosen up that dried debris. And then you can scrape off those big chunks with the brush, or stiff brush, or a stiff broom, or a hose if you're working outside. Again, wear a mask, you know, so that you're not inhaling any of those organisms. And then after you get the big chunks off, then you want to wash with a detergent. So you can use a dish soap. You can, if whatever you're trying to clean is uh, heat tolerant enough or small enough, then you could definitely run it through the dishwasher. And then afterwards, you want to rinse that soap away. So make sure everything is rinsed really well. And if you can, it's great to allow the object, you know, your cage or the toys or whatever you're cleaning, to then dry before you move on to the next step. So drying allows you, when you do use your disinfectant, it will keep that disinfectant at the proper ratio and not get diluted with whatever standing water or clinging water there might be on that object. So if you can, either allow it to air dry or dry it with a towel, so that when you disinfect, you'll be really disinfecting at the proper ratio. And so the next step after cleaning and after drying is going to be disinfecting. There are lots of products that can disinfect and do a good job. And I've listed a few here along with you know, their technical names along with their brand name. And there are, of course, many brands out there, but some of the more common ones that people know of would be chlorhexidine or Novosan. A sodium hypochlorite is bleach, your regular household bleach. Accelerated hydrogen peroxide. This is kind of a newer type of product that people can find. They use it quite a lot in human hospital situations. There's an animal version out there called Rescue. And there are groups of disinfectants called phenols, and everyone knows that by the name Lysol. And then there are also quaternary ammonium products, Rocal and Parvasol, and there's a bird one, I believe it's, forget the name of it off the top of my head, but there is one that's marketed towards bird owners as well. And basically, one of the biggest take homes I would like to emphasize is that you do have to follow the directions for dilutions of these products. Each product should have recommendations on the bottle, what kind of ratio, how to dilute it for it to work properly, and what kind of situation you're trying to disinfect. If you wing it and you aren't really measuring things out, you can cause a lot of problems. So sometimes the product won't work as well. Sometimes even if it's too concentrated, it's still not going to work as well. Or you may cause issues with the actual product you're trying to disinfect. You may break down some of the plastic, or you know, cause something to leach out that's not supposed to leach out. So it's really important that you follow those directions on the dilution of the product, as well as the contact time. So there should be an indication of how much time that product needs to be in contact with the disinfectant. So try not to skip corners with that. Um, and we all should note also that birds are very sensitive to fumes, and you do not want to use a disinfectant when your bird is right there. So try to remove the bird or take the product, take the item that you're trying to clean and disinfect out of the room or outside, somewhere where your bird is not close by. And of course, make sure you are rinsing your product very, very well after you're done disinfecting, before you reintroduce the bird back. And it is also ideal, even after you've gone through the disinfecting process, if you're able to place the object, the toy, the cage, whatever it is, into the direct sunlight, so that UV radiation is going to additionally kill some of these very stubborn microorganisms. There are some things that are really resistant to disinfectants and to our cleaning, that UV radiation will actually take care of. So if you're in an environment in the summertime and you're doing a good thorough clean, do that as well. And that will give you an added layer of disinfection. And a lot of people do want to know, what's the best product? So out of all these products listed here, which one should I choose? And there's unfortunately not a perfect answer, and I'm going to explain that a little bit more on this slide. So this is a very busy slide, but it's really, really great at showing us that there's not one single product that works for everything. So over on the far left side, we have a breakdown of different categories of organisms. So mycoplasmas, gram-positive, bacteria, gram-negative, pseudomonads, rickettsia, viruses, chlamydia, non-enveloped viruses. So, and it goes all the way down to prions, which we all know those are, they're very, very resistant to everything. So the most easily susceptible things are listed at the top, and then it just goes down in order to the most resistant. And then going across the table, we have groups of disinfectants. So there's, in the first group, we have acids. So acetic acid, that's going to be basically your vinegar. Now, I don't know if this acetic acid is an industrial strength acetic acid, like a 20%, or if it's your household acetic acid. My guess is it's industrial and not your household concentration. But moving across all the way to the right, we have alcohols, we have aldehydes, we have alkalis, which is the sodium hydroxide, ammonium hydroxide, and then next to that would be chlorhexidine. So kind of right in the middle category, we have chlorhexidine, and you can see that those first three groups of organisms, it disinfects really, really well. It targets those very, very well. And then it's a little less so as you move a little further down the chart. And move over one more column, and we're looking at sodium hypochlorite. So that's bleach, your regular household bleach. And if you look at that column, it is a very good disinfectant. So we've got pluses and like almost every category. So I would say by far for my bird owners, I am recommending for a disinfectant to use bleach, household bleach. Again, the right ratio, the right contact time. Your bird should not be around the bleach, and it should be rinsed very, very well afterwards. But as a disinfectant, it's highly effective. If you move over a couple more rows, then there is the accelerated hydrogen peroxide. It's very similar to bleach. It has nice efficacy going, fairly far down the list. The nice thing about accelerated hydrogen peroxide is I feel like that there's very, very little, if any, airborne irritation from that. So if you're living in a really small apartment and you just don't have many options, that might be a really good option for you as far as if you don't have another room that you can put your bird in. The um, let's see here, the accelerated hydrogen peroxide definitely needs to be diluted like normal, and your normal contact time, but it's a great option as well for bird owners. And then moving a little further over, you have the Lysol, which works great, as you can see, for those first four or so um, groups of bacteria. Not quite as good going down, but Lysol, as many of you know, is a bit irritating as far as the respiratory tract. So still a good option, but we've got options here. And one thing that's important to know, if you have an aviary, if you have a pet store, or a group where you're really trying to address a particular disease, if you have identified a particular disease in your group and you're really trying to get everything cleared up and prevent any new infections, talk with your avian vet about that particular organism, that particular disease, and they should be able to say, okay, this is going to be your best disinfectant for your situation, because there's not one single one that's going to be absolutely perfect for every situation. But talk to your vet if you do have a particular concern in mind, and then they can guide you as to which one to do. Okay, so moving on from that busy slide. So again, what about vinegar? I do get this question a lot. And your standard white household vinegar is going to be somewhere around 4 to 7% acetic acid. Some types, and that's going to be your more industrial strength, can contain up to 20% acetic acid. That would probably be pretty hard for your average person to acquire. But vinegar does work very well as a cleaner. So it's going to work really, really well at helping to remove debris, helping to remove food, kind of using it as that first line of defense like you would soap and water. It is limited in its ability as a disinfectant. It is mostly going to be a disinfectant against certain types of bacteria, and they're usually going to be foodborne bacteria. It's not very good with various viruses or addressing fungus. So it isn't something I would recommend as a disinfectant, but for sure you can use it as kind of a first line cleaner, and pretty safe for your birds. So still, I would recommend to follow with some rinsing afterwards, because you don't want necessarily vinegar to sit on your bird's foot. But as far as them ingesting it, it's not going to harm them to ingest little bits of residue of vinegar. And finally, so how often should we be doing these things? I definitely recommend change your bird's cage paper daily. And this, as I mentioned from the beginning, this is one of the best ways that you can assess your bird's droppings. And those droppings are often going to be changing very quickly if there's a problem, and it can be your first sign that your bird is ill or having issues. So change your cage paper daily. It will make them a healthier bird, and it will allow you to pick up on problems a lot sooner. I would also recommend to change or clean the cage grate or the bottom, as well as the perches, about once a week. So remove that feces with the dry and wet removal process. So scrape it off if you can, use some water if you can, and then follow with soap. If it's something you can put in the dishwasher, put in the dishwasher, or use your vinegar to clean the surface. But try to do that once a week. That will dramatically keep things from building up. And then clean your food dishes and water dishes daily to weekly. A daily would be ideal. I know practically a lot of people aren't doing that, and it depends somewhat on how often you're putting wet foods into the food dish. If there's wet foods going in there every day, you should be cleaning those dishes every day. The water, maybe every few days, depending on if you have a water bottle versus an open cup, or if they're dunking their food in the water, then it's going to get, pretty yucky pretty quick. So daily to weekly, you should be doing the cleaning of the food dishes. And then you want to disinfect. So you want to do that more intense disinfect process about monthly. So cage surfaces, toys, all of the furniture inside, the bowls. You do want to get into a habit of doing that once a month. That will dramatically decrease and minimize the amount of bacteria the bird's exposed to. There's a lot of bacteria that they can pass through their droppings that in small amounts is not a big deal. But if they're constantly exposed to it, they're re-ingesting it accidentally, then it can cause a problem after a while. So disinfect once a month. Anytime there's exposure to new birds, if you bring a new bird in and are pet sitting, or if you've adopted a new bird, or if for some reason your bird has become sick and you couldn't figure out why or didn't know why, do a thorough and full clean of everything each time. And that'll really help to keep your bird as healthy as possible. It's one of the best things that you can do to be good stewards to them. And I think now we can kind of open it up to our questions.
Yes, and we are at 2:30. Do you have time to stay with us for some questions? We had a number
Oh
of
yeah,
questions come in. Okay,
yeah,
excellent.
I do have time. So yeah, if you've got anything that you'd like to ask away.
Fantastic. There are a number of questions that came in about the big morning poop,
Yes.
and how it differs. Some people said, it's waterier.
Yes.
Some people, and they mentioned species too, African grays and green-winged macaws. There was even a smell to that first poop.
Uh-huh. I do agree. I think that that's considered one of those normal abnormalities. I don't know if there's been a study to understand why it happens. My suspicion is just there's certain birds that maybe they eat a little bit later in the evening, and then they just hold everything overnight. They're not waking up and having bowel movements overnight, and so that just kind of builds up, so to speak. And then they will tend to have a big poop. A lot. I've seen it in macaws a lot. So yes, I do think that is a normal abnormality. It should be a pretty isolated thing. So it should be something that happens. That first poop, maybe the second one that they've had, and then after that they should be back to normal. So it should not carry through the rest of the day. The other thing I feel like some of these guys, when they do have those morning poops, it will really have an odor to it. And I don't think that's 100% normal. So I've definitely seen birds that had the big poops and there was no smell. It was just the normal bird poop. So if your bird's having morning poops like that and there's a just knock you off your chair kind of smell to it, then there's probably something that needs to be evaluated. Maybe it's the type of food they're eating. Maybe they could benefit from some kind of probiotic or something like that. But I would have that evaluated.
Great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, we had a question from a vet come in. How do I deal with constipated birds? They have a client that had a bird that was constipated.
Well, true constipation is not normal. So if there's a constipation, and I'm assuming that he or she is referring to a bird that seems to be straining to go, that would be kind of what constipation technically is an animal that is trying to actually pass something and they literally are straining. If that's happening, there's probably a physical obstruction. So something somewhere is keeping that bird from being able to release the dropping the way it normally would. I would start probably with, besides your regular blood work and fecal test, I think the most valuable would probably be a set of x-rays to see if there's anything that looks like a enlargement of an organ, or just something that just doesn't quite look normal, because that constipation definitely should not be happening. There are some birds that can have problems digesting certain foods, but generally that would look like a dropping that would be, have like kind of almost that whole seed component, like the food just would be passing through without really being digested. So that does happen, but there should not be constipation.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, and someone had a question that I thought was really interesting about monitoring lorikeet poop.
Ah,
Um, and what
yeah,
do
that's a
you
little
have
different.
for that?
Um, was the question just as far as like how is it going to look and be different?
Because it's already typically pretty wet and
Yes.
can have a wide variety within the appearance. So how do they know when it's normal and not?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's going to have to be more that they have to know what is their bird normally going to be doing day to day, and not necessarily comparing it to your regular Amazon or African gray poops. But yeah, just kind of, and it can get kind of complicated. But maybe just notice, oh, okay, I'm going to feed my bird in the morning and then evening, and what's the poop going to look like an hour or two later, versus in the middle of the day. And that can be really helpful to kind of get that pattern. You don't have to write it down or anything, but just in your mind, think, okay, this is a weird looking poop, but he just ate an hour ago, where he had a lot of liquid. So this is why, this is most likely why in the middle of the day, there should be some different poops that don't have that much liquid to them. So I think it's a little more complicated for sure with them. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. And there was a similar question about monitoring an eclectus's poop too, who sometimes, we're told need more fruits and veggies a couple times a day too. So
Yeah, yeah, very similar kind of thing. It almost you just have to kind of keep thinking in your mind, like what's the food diary? What have they had today or this morning? And is there a reasonable explanation for it? If there's not a reasonable explanation, then that's when you should get concerned. It can be tough with these birds that have such a variety. And especially if they're eating all through the day, it's really tough. But if you're feeding them certain times of the day, it can get a lot easier, because they're going to pass that food through their system so quickly.
great. Thanks. Okay. We had a question come in early on that if a bird does have increased thirst, what could that be a sign of?
Well, it's there's a lot of things potentially. So it can sometimes happen with something as easy as they're overheated. So if they're under a heat lamp or in a hot environment, they're going to drink a little bit more. But physically, if there's a disease such as kidney disease, kidney failure, there can be diabetes. Birds can get diabetes, which would cause them to drink more water. Um, there can be some birds that would do it as a behavioral thing. So if they, for whatever reason, decide to get sort of a habit or an abnormal interest in their water dish, they can drink more. That's pretty unusual, but it's possible. And then I also have seen it happen with birds that just get an infection. So they get an infection either in their GI tract somewhere, it causes them to want to drink more water, or in their kidneys or someplace like that. So it definitely, there's not a single cause for it. There's a lot of causes, but something that I would say if it's happening frequently, then you would want to have it checked out.
Great.
And a lot of times those kind of cases, you'd think that they're going to test the feces, which they probably will, but they'll need to do some blood work if possible.
Excellent. Good to be prepared for. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, and we actually had a couple questions also come in about diabetes. One person asked, what would cause diabetes in a bird? Essentially, could we give it to them by giving them too much fruit? And another one is, how would you diagnose diabetes in bird? Is it the same as in other small animals?
Well, that's a very good question. So birds that get diabetes, usually it's not because of getting too much fruit or sugar. It's usually because their body weight overall has been too heavy. or it's essentially a just genetic thing that happens. So some birds will develop it and there's no clear reason why they've developed it. It's just something has gone wrong with their pancreas and they're not producing the things they're supposed to. So either being overweight or obese for too long or just a genetic predisposition. Of course, being obese might be tied into getting too much fruit, but it's probably more tied into getting too much fat, maybe too much protein, too much human junk food. A lot of times we'll do that. Processed things like carbohydrates and that kind of stuff. What was the second question?
Oh, how would you diagnose
Oh,
diabetes?
yes. Oh, it's very tough in birds. Usually birds, in a dog or a cat, a lot of times you can run specific blood tests, or you can do what they call a glucose curve, and we don't have that available for birds. So generally it's about ruling out other problems and checking blood, finding an extremely high glucose level, finding glucose in their urine, finding increased amount of urine, ruling out infection as a cause. So it's kind of a hard thing to diagnose, but it is done. And unfortunately, it's also hard to treat in birds because, as you would imagine, all of our insulins that we have are for mammals. So far, there's not, as far as I'm aware, a good insulin that's reliably effective in birds. So it's not a disease you want to have, unfortunately.
Sounds like there's a lot of potential for research in that area. Anyone is aspiring to go to vet school and needs
Yes.
a research topic.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay, so there's another one. Are there any birds that would normally have greenish or yellow urate?
Well, the greenish or yellow urates. No, I cannot think of a situation where they should be normally greenish or yellow. Now, they can sometimes, if the actual feces is very green, then that pigment can sometimes migrate into the urates or the urine as it sits in the cloaca. So you can sometimes see greenish urine and urates that's really because of the feces being super duper green. So that does happen occasionally. But as far as a normal, I cannot think of a situation where there would be a bird with normal green or yellow.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So someone had a question about puppy pads, that they were concerned, they had read that they were, or heard that they had been treated with something that's not safe for birds. So are using human incontinence pads instead. Do you know, are either safe or unsafe?
I don't, there may be some puppy pads out there that are treated with something. I'm assuming maybe it's some kind of scent or something like that. I mean, I definitely would stay away from anything that was scented. Incontinence pads should be totally fine. So I feel like those are the same kind of, just an absorbent material that shouldn't have any kind of odor to it. And of course, you wouldn't want it to be something that the bird could get to and shred or ingest, because a lot of those have a little bit of plastic on the backside of them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then we had a question. How long do results for gram tests take? And also, what is the best medium to collect a sample to ensure they stay moist on the way to the vet?
The turnaround for the gram stain totally depends on who is doing it. So some clinics will do a gram stain at the clinic and have either a vet tech read it or have the avian vet read the sample. So it just totally depends on, if that's the case, when they're able to do that. It's a relatively time consuming test to run. So just having to actually physically do the test takes a good chunk of time. And then reading it takes a very good chunk of time too. So if it's the avian vet who's doing it, it may be the end of the day sometimes before you actually hear what those results were. Now there are other labs, there are certain types of diagnostic labs that will do gram stains as well. And, it may be the same situation for them. It takes a while to get the sample to them. and then they would run it, and then depending on what pathologist or person is reading it, then they have to go through the whole process of doing the counts. The counts are labor intensive. They'll take that slide I talked about, that microscope slide, and then with the microscope, they may look at 5 to 10 fields, and in each field they might count 100 bacteria and keep track of the different kinds of bacteria, gram positive, gram negative, gram positive cocci. And then it's a lot of math that's done, and basically that translates into a percentage for those different fields, and then they might average all of those different fields. So it's pretty labor intensive, and that's why a lot of clinics tend to not do it. You have to have one that's a person reading them that's very, very skilled, that feels confident in what they're seeing, and is really fast and efficient. And you have to have someone else that's really good at actually doing the staining properly. The staining process is like, put the slide in this solution for 30 seconds, then take it out and rinse it, but don't rinse it too hard. Rinse it just enough, and then put it in another stain for 15 seconds, take it out. So it's really, really like, very, very intense recipe. And there's a lot of places where that can go wrong if it's not done properly. So a lot of clinics now will send out their gram stains to be done by a diagnostic lab, where that's all they're doing all day long. And those results might take a day or two or longer to get back, and then the vet has to analyze them as well.
Got it. Great. Thank you. We had a few questions about different products too. One was, of course, there's so many new disinfectants out there because of COVID.
Right.
Would any of them, like the 7th generation sprayer wipes, or the Purell disinfectant surface spray, would any of those be like possible to be used on bird cages and stuff?
I don't feel like there's enough evidence to be able to recommend them. Just with things being so new, I don't think I would stick with the stuff that we know. So that the stuff that was in sort of that chart there, that's going to really be your go-to, of what we know is going to work well. Again, you can use certain, I would say that the Purell, that's going to be your ethanol, that's got the alcohol, that's going to work pretty well for a lot of things, but again, not necessarily the best option. And you still want to do your rinsing and your drying and all that kind of stuff, and not next to the bird. It's tough, but I would stick with kind of the ones we know.
And this chart too, I know Cassie had posted a link in the chat, and we also posted it in the Q&A for folks who want to go back and refer to it too. So great. We had a couple questions about steam cleaners, and if there was a way to disinfect. Could they be used to disinfect as opposed to a chemical cleaner?
As far as I know, steam cleaners aren't going to disinfect. They're not going to get to a level of heat high enough, to really be, it's not like an autoclave, where we sterilize instruments for surgery. That's a moist heat that's under pressure and really, really hot. So I just don't think a steam cleaner is going to clean and do that initial cleaning phase, but it's not going to disinfect.
That's very helpful. Very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
And then just 2 other products that were mentioned. Someone had asked about poop off, specifically whether it's a cleaner or a disinfectant, and if you had thoughts on it.
I have seen poop off, and I do not remember the ingredients in there. So I'd have to look at the ingredient list, honestly. Like it should be on there. It should be listed. So if you can look at the ingredient list and see that it's got one of these things, then it should be okay. My guess is that it's probably more of a cleaner and not a disinfectant.
Great. And someone also asked about grapeseed oil, if that was a disinfectant, if you knew.
I don't believe so. No, it would be more of a cleaner, if anything.
Okay. Someone did have, if you're looking at the array of disinfectants, and you have a bird that has been diagnosed, or I guess suspected to have PDD, what
Mhm.
would which of these from the lineup would they want to use?
For like a PED, you said. So I would probably go with the bleach, to be honest. Bleach probably would be the best option just because you're getting so many categories. A bird that has PDD may not just have a viral issue, it may have all these secondary bacterial issues. Their immune system might be compromised. So I think that that bleach is going to give you the most comprehensive, disinfected across the board. It would definitely be the ideal.
Great. Okay, excellent. Well, I know that we have gone a good 20 minutes over when we said the end time. So I don't want to take up any more of your time. I think we hit a lot of the big categories that people had
Good.
for questions.
Yay.
Um, and once more cannot thank you enough
Oh,
for being here and talking with us. And I also really want to thank all the people who have attended too, because I mean, the fact that you love your birds enough to come and spend an afternoon talking about poop. And I loved when Dr. Rhyne, you were talking about regurgitation and vomit too. I'm like, all right, we've got poop, we've got
we got it
regurgitation.
all. That's right.
Yeah,
That's dedication for you, right?
yeah. We're getting all kinds of interesting things, here.
That's
And
right. That's right. Hopefully everybody's done with lunch, I hope.
yeah, but I really, really appreciate this too, because what I love about this is something that we need to monitor at home.
Right.
And know if we're seeing diarrhea, if we're seeing the, vomiting and stuff like that, we need to go to the vet. If
Right.
the feces are different, and how to
Yeah.
monitor and what's the best way and how to clean plus disinfect that, I think it was very helpful, that schedule you provided and things, and
Good.
both are needed and
Yes.
with differing frequencies.
Right.
So
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I'm very happy and for that you had me, and hopefully everyone learned a little something. And yeah, I'll love to do it again.
great, great. Thank you once more. And again, everyone who attended today, give me about a day. Our internet can be really slow out here in the mountains to get a copy of this uploaded, but once we do, I'll send out a link to everyone. And thank you again. Thank you again, Dr. Rhyne, and
Oh,
to all
thank
of you
you.
folks.
Thanks a
Bye.
lot. Take care. Bye bye.